This episode of Paradigm Profiles is about Monster Cody and the H-Ray Gangsters. In late 1994, I was still reveling and gloating over my newfound marriage. It had only been a few months since I had taken the plunge and willingly embraced the vows that I had made to my new wife. Although this wasn't the first time I had taken a walk down the aisle and had accepted the eternal vows in which the union of marriage is built on, this marriage was different. As I was still relishing and basking in the honeymoon phase, there was no doubt in my heart that I had committed my life to the right woman. But there was no tuxedo, there was no ceremonious cutting of the cake, and there was no pastor consecrating the marriage. Instead, there were two longtime NF members who were both giving their blessings and ratifying my marriage to La Nuestra Familia. The term marriage is an endearing and synonymic term that's commonly used amongst members within the organization to describe the process of recruitment and membership. In fact, back in the 70s and 80s, when some of the older members would be asked by law enforcement what their NF tattoo stood for, they would reply that it was the initials of their wife's name, Nancy Flores. Not long after my induction, I was put on a bus to Pelican Bay State Prison, where I spent the next 4 months wrapping up a 12-month parole violation. I didn't mind taking that ride back to Pelican Bay Shoe because it was a scenic ride that was tranquil and relaxing. It was a ride that I was all too familiar with and had taken many times. There was something about milling past hundreds of miles of an unpaved stretch of Holland Hill Road while being given an intimate encounter with thousands of towering old-growth redwoods on the Del Norte coast that mesmerized me every time I took that ride. So the ride was something I looked forward to, but it took 8 long, arduous hours to get there, and being crammed in a cage wearing shackles and belly chains made it a little uncomfortable. But this was my last look at the free world for the next 4 short months. These were the last images that I would take in and replay in my mind over and over whenever I allowed my mind to travel outside the barren concrete walls of Pelican Bay. Each stretch along this highway, looking at the towering redwoods and the foggy coast, were like snapshots taken in frozen time. When I got back to the shoe during this violation, they ran us through the customary routine that I had been through so many times. We got our welcoming speech from one of the custody sergeants who was waiting for us on the back dock with the rest of the welcoming party, 30 of the biggest corn-fed COs that worked in the shoe. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Pelican Bay State Prison. This is the end of the line. This is our house. You guys don't run shit here. I don't care who you are, what kind of status you think you have, or how ghetto fabulous you are within your gang. It means absolutely nothing to us. Now that you're here, there are only 3 ways you are going to leave: die, debrief, or parole. My rules are simple. You give respect, you might get respect. You get disrespectful, you're going to experience one of the worst elevator rides in your life. We don't compromise and we don't negotiate with inmates. You cause problems, your property will get lost. You let us do our job without any interference, and we'll get you to your housing units as fast as we can. Questions? And this concluded our welcoming speech. From that point on, we were walked backwards through a metal detector and were then filed into the law library. From there, it was about an hour wait before we were all walked over to C1, which was then called the orientation block. The orientation block was only used for about a year, and then they eventually discontinued it. After you went to ICC, Institutional Classification Committee, which took about 3 weeks, then they would move you to a regular block where everybody was at. You'd either end up somewhere in D facility in one of 10 blocks, or you'd end up in one of 11 blocks in C facility. There were actually 12 blocks in C facility, but C12 was a THU, Transitional Housing Unit, basically protective custody, or Punk City, or guys that were going through a transitional program and were then being slowly phased out to an S&Y. Because I only had a little over 3 months left on my parole violation, I made a verbal request to be housed in the pre-release program and got lucky. In order to qualify for the pre-release program, you had to be within 90 days or less of your release date. Since they had open cells over there, they allowed me to go straight over there from C1. This definitely had its advantages. Whenever you pulled back up to Pelican Bay as a new arrival, you had to go through the process of ordering a new TV or a radio, whatever you decided. But either way, you had nothing in that cell for at least 3 to 4 months, the time it took for them to process an appliance order. So it was all about reading books, playing chess over the tier, and doing other things to eat up all that idle time. But if you went to pre-release, part of the program consisted of watching videos every day for about 2 hours. Then you used to have to fill out a questionnaire with regards to what you learned from the videos. If you had a TV, then you were already set. But if you were someone like me who just got off the bus and didn't have one, they provided one for you. This was an immediate come up. The daily videos were a nuisance, and there was really nothing educational or beneficial about them. But this was a small worthwhile sacrifice considering the trade-off of having a dummy box to watch for the remainder of the day, especially during football season. The other benefit was Mateo from Salinas was housed over there and I needed to touch base with him. The pre-release program only consisted of A and B sections in C6. The rest of the block was regular housing, and this is where Mateo had been housed for a few years now. The following day after moving to C6, it was around 1 p.m. in the afternoon, and I was still in the process of giving the cell a top to bottom scrub down. This is something I used to do every time I'd move into a new cell. I'd scrub every inch, crack, and crevice of that cell until it almost had an antiseptic feel about it. By the time I was done, all the past occupants who had lived in this cell before me were thoroughly and painstakingly washed away. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. I had my TV tuned in to Rap City, bumping all the new rap songs that had just come out. I had my handmade boombox speakers rigged up, bumping my music as loud as it could be bumped. It almost sounded like I had two 8x12 speakers in a customized speaker box. It was bumping so loud. I'm actually adding a little humor to this because my so-called 8x12 speakers consisted of a pair of generic Canteen bot headphones that I had connected to a pair of rolled up paper cones. The cones act as enclosures and radiates the sound the same way speakers do. A little bit of ingenuity goes a long way. It probably helps that the shoe environment is usually real quiet too. So on this particular day that I was in my cell doing this scrub down, I remember hearing the door to the cell next to mine give off a loud metallic clank and then the electric hum of the door slowly sliding across this track. This cell was empty, so I knew this could only mean one thing. They were bringing in a new arrival. Somebody was getting ready to move in next to me. Anyone that's done time will tell you that this is always a cause for excitement. A new character, someone to talk to, and a new neighbor was always something I got stoked up about. The floor officer came into the pod, walked up the stairs, and straight into the empty cell next to mine. This was a routine they did every time someone moved into a new cell. They do a quick check for contraband, and then they do a quick check to make sure all the facilities work. Turn the lights on, push the water button on the sink, and then a flush of the toilet. After they went through all the motions, then they bring in the next lucky resident. Whoever it was that was moving in was already in one of the holding cages that's right outside the grill gate, because I heard the officer key the door and then slowly roll the gate open. I quickly got up, positioning myself into the crack of my door and worked myself into the best contorted position I could. This, of course, was so that I could see as much of the pod as possible. No doubt, every other inmate in that pod was doing the same thing. This is what inmates do whenever a new resident is about to be introduced into their world. If you were looking into the pod at this exact moment, there's no doubt in my mind that you'd see a big curious eyeball in every crack of every door in the pod. As I was standing there waiting to catch the first glimpse of my new neighbor, I knew he'd be rounding the corner any second because the metallic sound of his shackle chains hitting the concrete floor got louder and louder. Then in walked a light-skinned Africano whose name I would later find out was Cody Monster Scott, a notorious Crip from the 8-Tray Gangsters. I had never ran into Monster before this, and I had never met him, but ironically, I had just read his book while I was in the county jail. When I first seen him walk into the pod, I still didn't know it was him, and I just didn't make that connection. It was only after talking to him later that I realized who he was. In prison, the term Africano is a term that's often used to describe black inmates out of a showing of respect. Other terms are used in Spanish by those who don't quite understand the gravity of respect, but I never used any of those terms as it's disrespectful. Contrary to what some people might think, a lot of them understood those terms and take it as disrespect. As an active norteño at the time, the blacks were considered to be an ally, so I always afforded them that respect. Once the 3 officers finished removing his chains and exiting the pod, I called over to him. "Hey homie that just came in." The pod was dead quiet. Everybody had their ear to the ground waiting to hear who this new arrival was and who he was affiliated with. I waited and then he responded, "Yeah, what's up?" I said, "Hey homie, what's your name? Where you coming from?" He said, "They call me Sanyika and I came from C3. I said, "Okay Sanyika, hey, it's a pleasure meeting you homie. They call me Boxer. I'm gonna go ahead and let you get yourself situated, but if there's anything you need over there, just holler at me." He said, "It's a pleasure meeting you as well, Boxer, and I appreciate that." Then he said, "You know what, Boxer, actually if you got it, what I need is some cleaning supplies so I could clean this cell." I told him, "Don't trip, I got you." The officer that was working in the nerve center or the control booth, an officer named George, was someone who I had known for years. George was hella cool. He had worked in other blocks I was housed in, and he always worked in the control booths. He was the kind of officer who understood our politics and let us do our thing. There were times when he popped my cell door open and would tell me, "Hey, come down to the grill gate." When I'd walk up to the gate, I'd look through the mesh and I'd see the silhouette of another homeboy standing at another gate in one of the other pods. The homie would be standing there unraveling his fish line, getting ready to send something over to me. George let us out so that we could fish, the act of tying a weight on a braided string and then using it as an extended line to pass a kite from cell to cell. He'd do this when the floor officers would leave the unit for a few minutes. George would say, "Hurry up, you guys got 5 minutes." But he not only did this for us, he was neutral. If you were cool and he got to trust you, he'd eventually open up and do things like this for you. He did it for the white inmates, the sureños, and the blacks. So I called out to George. "Hey George, this is Mendoza in 209. Can you pop my door so I can give my neighbor these cleaning supplies?" Clank. My door opened and I stepped out on the tier real quick and slid a couple green scrub pads under his door along with some cleanser and some liquid disinfectant. I said, "Here you go homie, let me know if you need anything else." Then I stuck the tip of my pinky through one of the small round holes in his gate as a gesture of shaking hands. He touched the tip of my pinky as a way of shaking my hand. We obviously can't shake each other's hands like we would if the gate wasn't between us, but this way of shaking hands is commensurate to shaking hands or a fist bump between inmates. Later on that day, after talking more at length with Sanyika, I came to realize that Sanyika was actually Monster Cody and that he was now going by the Muslim name Sanyika after having converted to the Nation of Islam. I knew from the minute I met Monster that he was different from the average Crip gangsters that I had become accustomed to meeting in the past. He was soft-spoken, articulate, calculating, and he had an air of confidence about him that was admirable. One of the things that I really respected and liked about Monster was his ability to engage in intellectual conversations. For me, stimulating the mind and delving off into these types of intellectual conversations with someone back there was important. And when it came to intellect, Monster was more than capable of holding his own. In fact, I learned a lot of things from him, and whenever he'd go into deep topics like the government, third world order, revolutionary fighters, communism, capitalism, gang banging, and just politics in general, he would almost go into a trance. Monster would start talking about some of these things and he'd just go into a different place. He'd zone out. At one point, his book came up. I was trying to wait for him to bring it up, but it seemed like an issue that he was trying to avoid. Maybe because he thought I might have had an adverse opinion about it, as some people do. They frown on it and liken it to snitching or giving up the blueprints. So I just said, "Hey Sanyika, I read your book and it was one of the best books I've ever read. Some of it was flattery, but in my opinion, it really was a good book." You guys are about to find out. He said, "Thank you, Boxer. I appreciate that, man. That book woke people up and gave America a small glimpse of what life is really like growing up in the ghetto." Once he started talking about it, I could tell he was real proud of it. He told me how successful it was, and then he told me about plans he was making to reinvest some of the money into some other small businesses. His thing was about giving back to his neighborhood and not forgetting about where he had come from. Over time, I developed a deep sense of respect and admiration for Monster, and there's no question about the fact that there was something profoundly different about him that stood out from any other Crip that I had ever met. Besides Tookie and Little Fee, who I had met years earlier on death row. In fact, I even mentioned to Monster that his book came up in separate conversations with both Tookie and Fee. I told him that they both accused him of twisting up some of the facts and that they also claimed he embellished some of the things he said about the Hoovers. Monster just laughed and said, "Man, everything that was written about in that book was based on facts, court transcripts, or police reports." Over the course of the next 3.5 months, me and Sanyika got tighter and even made plans to start networking out on the streets. I had a good meth connect at the time, and I told him I'd set him up with him once we both touched back down. I called him one time once we were both out, and we tentatively made plans to meet up somewhere between LA and Frisco, but unfortunately, I never stayed out long enough to make it happen. It's now been close to 27 years since I met Monster in the SHU program at Pelican Bay State Prison. A lot of things have obviously happened since then. Although we never got a chance to link up out on the streets as we had once planned, I always tried to keep track and follow Monster, either through social media, the streets, or through some other means out there. When I first jumped on this YouTube craze, I'd occasionally plug his name in and see what kinds of things were being said about him and just what he was pursuing for himself out there. YouTube had a lot of content about him, and it also put a face to his mother, Birdie Scott, who I had heard him talk a lot about on more than one occasion. In fact, his mother, Birdie, was a huge part of Monster's life. I can personally attest to this. I vividly remember how he used to talk about her and how he spoke of the regret he held for the way he stressed her out and worried her while he was out there running around in the streets. But his real pain came from the memories he expressed about his father, Ernest Scott. Monster's father, who always displayed open contempt for Monster, will be the primary reasons why Monster turned to the streets and a street gang for the sense of family. Monster's father physically and emotionally abused him, routinely beating him and showing deliberate favoritism toward his biological children over Monster, which included taking the other children out to dinners, movies, and trips to his hometown of Houston, while intentionally leaving Monster behind. When Monster spoke about his father, he spoke with disdain and he said he hated him. For the most part, I believe that those feelings were somewhat real, but I think it was more about resentment than it was about hatred. He wanted a father who was never there, someone who'd take him to the park and teach him how to throw a football, how to hit a baseball, someone who'd teach him how to ride a bike, and just be a father, just have a father to look up to. In an interview Monster did in 1993, while he was still housed in Pelican Bay State Prison, he spoke about his father, and his pain was on display for the whole world to see. They can call him a monster, and they can talk about the numerous acts of violence he has committed throughout his life. But this interview humanized him and proved that even guys like Monster can empathize and identify with pain just like anyone else. If you care to see it, Just go on YouTube and type in Monster Cody interview 1993 in Pelican Bay. Then spin up to timestamp 1016. In 1972, after Bertie Scott divorced Monster's father, she moved her family into a house on West 69th Street and Denker Avenue in a rough gang-infested neighborhood on the west side of South Central Los Angeles. This is when Monster began getting involved with gangs and crime. In 1975, a member of the West Side Crips, nicknamed Sidewinder, formed a sect called the 8-Trade Gangster Crips, also known as 83GC, ETG, or ETGC, in Monster's neighborhood. On the evening of June 15, 1975, the day of his 6th grade graduation, Monster was courted or initiated into the ETGs. As a new member of the Crips, Monster was mentored in the ways of gangbanging by his homeboy Trey Ball. In 1977, when Monster was 13, Trey Ball attempted to rob an older African American man who was pushing through their neighborhood. This guy punched Monster in the face, and after being physically restrained by Trey Ball when he attempted to run, was kicked and stomped by Monster for approximately 20 minutes. This beatdown was so vicious that it left the guy in a coma with a permanently disfigured face. According to other Crips who were present when the police were investigating the assault, the police were overheard saying whoever committed this assault was a monster. From that point on, other members of ETG began referring to Cody as Monster. Some wrote Monster off as an incorrigible, saying that he was beyond change. This was all based on the way he lived his life and the level of violence he displayed. However, this wasn't the same Monster I met in Pelican Bay. I think his conversion to Islam and just where he was at in life was already helping him make the kind of transition that nobody thought was possible. He was humble, and I think he was just at a point in life where he was beginning to realize that there's a better path out there. Coincidentally, I googled him a few months ago and seen that he had started doing interviews on another YouTube channel called Kev Mac Videos. It was good to see Monster still out there doing his thing, but my boy had a look about him that led me to believe that he was either sick or that he was falling back into some of his old habits. I can't definitively say that he was or he wasn't, one way or the other, because I don't know. But a mutual friend that I just recently spoke to told me he was. And aside from the way Monster looked in some of those videos, it was also a little suspicious that he began wearing dark shades that covered his eyes. All I can say is that I hope I'm wrong and that I hope he didn't start going back down that road. And I don't bring these things up to paint him in any kind of a negative light, because we all go through our struggles. I only raise all the possibilities just so we can understand what he might have been going through. So unfortunately, on June 6, 2021, just a few days ago, I got a phone call from that same mutual friend who told me that Monster had just passed away. I found out before some of the mainstream media stations started putting it out. I was shocked, to say the least. Monster was young. He was only 57, and like so many other young, talented black and Hispanic men, he was taken from us too soon. And he was my friend. Whether you like Monster or not, and whether you respected him or not, he left behind a legacy that will continue to live with us forever. He was a father, a son, a husband, and a friend to many. This story was meant to serve as not only a tribute to Monster and his life, but also as a memorial for those of us who considered him to be a friend. Rest in peace, homie, and prayers go out to you and your family. November 13, 1963 to June 6, 2021.